laggy or anything. Can everyone hear me though?
Mm-hmm. Loud and clear, sir.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to present the philosophy of Daniel Dennett. He's a very prominent philosopher of mind and science. He's still alive, right? Whereas most prominent philosophers are dead hundreds of years ago. Um, all things considered, he may not be that original, but he is someone who kind of offers commentary on a lot of philosophical debates within science and the philosophy of mind. So he's a very interesting and obviously highly intelligent guy. So of course, his specific area is in the study of consciousness. And here's a quote he has on what's called qualia. Some of you may remember that in our discussion last week. So he just calls it an unfamiliar term for something that could not be more familiar to each of us. It's the way things seem to us, right? So it's almost like, consciousness is everything. It's our everything. It is everything we experience, right? But yet it is unfamiliar as a science, and it's illusory or mysterious and whatever. So although he says it's highly familiar to us, we do not control it. Okay, and he offers examples like change blindness. I've thrown in an example myself, which is the Gestalt principles, which is basically like they're these principles from German psychologists who basically go like, this is how the basic perceptual system organizes information so you perceive things in an accurate way. You don't control that. You don't control your like visual perception. You don't control that kind of stuff. Change blindness is actually a psychological phenomenon, and we'll talk about it later. But he predicted it in his book, right? Which is very interesting to see a prediction of something in psychology and neuroscience from a philosopher, right? And Dennett approaches the answer of what is consciousness by arguing what it is not. And this is very much like all approaches in science today, or at least most of them, right? This sort of tendency in science is something which has become so popular since the incorporation of null hypothesis significance testing, which is a form of statistics, right? So since science often doesn't like approach the truth by approaching it directly, it approaches the truth by doing what? Canceling out null hypotheses, right? And so that's kind of what he's doing here, where he says science is not this. I mean, consciousness is not this. Consciousness is not that. Consciousness is something else, which we'll not talk about. So he talks primarily about consciousness as an illusion, all right? So meaning consciousness does not arise from a magical source, a transcendental or divine one, immaterial sources like the soul. That's all an illusion, he says, okay? We try to understand consciousness from our own model, meaning the one we experience, but there's limits to this kind of introspection, right? For example, try to imagine what it would be like to be a bat. You have no idea what echolocation would feel like, right? And moreover, the bat has no idea what it would be like maybe to understand speech or, internal thought, like internal verbal thought, right? Note that this suggests that consciousness comes in various forms. So although that we're different from bats, it's totally plausible that the bat is conscious, however you choose to define that. Determining who or what is conscious, however, then comes down to determining the universal features of consciousness, or a solid definition. To throw back to the information integration theory, as we talked about it last week, right? Tononi has very specific definitions and rules for what is a physical system. And then Tononi says that anything that meets those rules, he is conscious and he quantifies it. So again, that was in my last week's presentation, but this is an important step in the study of consciousness. So in determining the forms or features of consciousness, you can then say, well, is Aidan conscious, right? Is Evan conscious? Is the relationship between me and Evan conscious? What about this group? Is the group of us a form of consciousness? Because some might say yes, but someone like Tononi would say no because it doesn't meet the requirements of a system. And then is a stomach conscious? So I know some proponents of Tononi's actually say yes, a stomach is conscious, or at least parts of it. And other people say that's a crazy idea, but some say, well, there's a great integration of information. It is a system, or at least parts of it are an integrated system where the information affects one another. But anyways, in any case, whatever is or is not conscious, Dennett says we need a large theory, right, to guide the scientific approach of studying consciousness. So he talks about consciousness as an automatic phenomenon, right? He says that what you are is 100 trillion cells. Each of them are unconscious. Not a single one is conscious. Only as a functional system do they become conscious, right? And this is an amazing idea, right? And it's broader than just in the field of consciousness, but it is the idea that the whole system is different than the sum of its parts, right? So you look at a brain, if you take apart every single neuron, that means nothing. But then if you look at it as a system, it now has consciousness and it has thought and it has information processing that is meaningful. And so, yes, like Tononi talks about this. Dennett has an interesting analogy, right, where he talks about an insect colony, right? And he says, think about maybe a farm of ants, right? Every single ant is doing its own little thing or whatever, but then you look at it in a colony and it's this like highly intelligent looking system. It's got a lot of structure. It's a really amazing system, and everyone's kind of acting together to do this kind of colonial intelligence. It's really amazing. There's other examples seen in nature, like, you know, fungal systems, right? So he also says that your concept of you, or sorry, he doesn't say this, I'm saying this. Your concept of you is produced by parts of your brain. However, you as a concept do not control your consciousness. And this is something Daniel is a proponent of. So he says you do not really have control of your consciousness, or at least most parts of it. That kind of just happens. Your consciousness, he says, are determined by many parts of your brain competing for this sort of king of the hill. And so consciousness as a cognitive process then is this kind of king of the hill, right? It's almost like a metacognition or a meta attention. It's just whatever cognitive functions take this sort of spotlight. It's almost like, and again, this is, you know, I was saying earlier that Dennett isn't exactly a totally original thinker. Well, you know, this kind of reminds me a lot of global workspace theory, which is like proposed back in the 40s or 50s, which is still one of the major three neuroscientific and cognitive theories of consciousness. But in any case, he says, you know, what the consciousness is, whatever your current experience is whatever is currently taking, you know, the centerfold. What is the primary processing? So, you know, you maybe think in your own life, okay, maybe I'm processing auditory information and focusing on it. Well, that's the consciousness right now. Okay, maybe I'm looking at artwork and I'm doing a lot of visual processing. That's the consciousness. Maybe I'm Simon and I'm doing a lot of math work. And so the consciousness is maybe, you know, that sheet of paper and whatever gears are turning in my head related to the mathematics. And so Robert Lorenz Kuhn, he asks him, well, this kind of doesn't sound like a definition of consciousness. This sounds like a definition of attention, right? And maybe, you know, maybe these things are different in a meaningful way, right? Because you can imagine a system which has attention but not consciousness, right? And so therefore they might be different, right? So he kind of pokes a criticism here at Dennett. And you can think of many systems which have attention, but maybe not consciousness. Maybe a machine orienting, or a plant orienting towards the sun, or a paramecium orienting towards light, right, with their red eye spot. But in any case, the cognitions of consciousness can't be explained by magic, right? This is falling into the illusion. Much like how a magic trick can't be explained as magic, neither can consciousness be explained by a spirit or magic, right? As he says, again, he's a philosopher of science, and he believes everything is boiled down to material and science and observable features. And so he says, again, consciousness doesn't arise from a soul. It doesn't arise from this internal picture. No, it is the brain, and it's the brain functioning. So he talks about, you know, science basically ruining the magic trick of consciousness, right? Science offers the real explanation, not magic, right? If you were looking at a magic act and I said, okay, well, how did you pull off that card trick? And you said it's magic, everyone in the room says, bullshit, that's not a real explanation. And so he says, similarly, that's not an explanation of consciousness. You can't just say it's a soul, it's immaterial, it's essentially magic. And he sort of brings to light, why can you not have this kind of explanation? Well, why can science provide a better explanation? And again, coming back to change blindness and other cognitive explanations and study, right? You need science to explain these things. So again, I'm gonna show you guys what change blindness is. Okay. change blindness is essentially anytime you have a change in a setting and it goes undetected. And Dennett predicted this based off of the fact that basically your visual perception, again, isn't a magical thing. It's a processing of information. And this processing of information relies essentially on your eye movements, right? Like your eye is the thing which is inputting the visual information, and then your brain processes it, right? And Dennett says, well, because the eyes saccade, they move back and forth like 3 to 4 times a second, even though you're not actually conscious of this. You do not know this, but right now you are not looking at the entire screen. You're looking at only parts of the screen, and you are taking in bits of information, and then your brain is creating an illusion that you're taking in the whole screen. You're not. You're only taking in the area of the fovea and then a little bit of stuff outside of that, but most of the screen you are not looking at. You're moving your eye 3 to 4 times a second, and then you're putting a bunch of information together with bias, and you're creating a perception of a whole setting here. And so the beautiful thing of change blindness, right, is you take people and you mess with their unconscious automatic processing, right? They're not controlling the conscious perception of vision and attention here. Moreover, it's just happening. And so these people will change the setting in a very clever way, and people typically do not notice.
Here's the setup. Our senior series producer, Vin, poses as a lost pedestrian and asks a passerby for directions.
Excuse me, I'm looking for the skyline.
Then, we break the two up, walking through them holding a large sheet of wood. Now watch as I replace Vin. You might think people would notice the switch, but almost half the time, they didn't. Of course, that means more than half the time they did. We only tried the experiment
Anyways, there's all kinds of examples of this where someone is like sitting behind a desk or whatever, pops down, pops up, and it's a totally new person. But in any case, you can't explain this by magic in the soul. You explain this as computation. You explain this as a computer system just trying its best to explain information. And he says, scientists as external observers give us many insights into our conscious processes, right? So, one is change blindness, yes, and you can't get that through introspection because through introspection, you're not even aware of change blindness, right? Only with science. There's other principles, again, the Gestalt principles and, principles of basic attention or, maybe emotion processing. Magical explanations don't provide these rich explanations, which we can then do science with and create technologies and useful products, right? However, here's the thing, the issue with Dennett in saying that magical explanations don't cut it. Well, why, right? He almost starts with his bias of there is no soul, and then he seeks to prove that. Well, if you maybe remember from last week, Chalmers is still not happy, right? Chalmers, he talks about, you have all of this objective, externally observable information in the universe, and these are all one form of information, and then the consciousness is a subjective, non-observable to everyone else kind of information. How does that objective information become subjective? Dennett offers no explanation, right? Dennett offers no explanation as to how is it that cognitive processes become seemingly immaterial, seemingly unobservable to anyone else, right? How is it that it creates an internal perception and feeling and experience, right? Because again, you can imagine a system like maybe your cell phone processing information. You would probably not assume that the cell phone has any experience of that information, right? So again, Dennett ultimately argues that science is the appropriate primary source or approach to studying consciousness, but he fails to explain how objective information becomes subjective and creates a seemingly immaterial experience. Moreover, he fails to explain how and why a cognitive process comes to dominate and become conscious. So he says, yeah, your stream of consciousness is whatever the primary cognitions are, but how, right? Like if you consider a neural network, how is it that you think of a brain as 100 billion neurons, how is it that, a collection, a subset of those neurons become the primary one? And he says, well, they're whatever are making the most, they're making the most wave, essentially, like they're making the most reactions with other networks. Well, like even then, it's like, why? How? Like what part of the brain is determining that is conscious? Where's the processing that determines that line of cognition is the conscious one? And then if you consider a neuronal mechanism as one failure. There's also the why. Like, why would evolution ever create neural mechanisms to become experience? Like, why would it ever do that? Right? So these are big questions that Dennett doesn't really address. We'll come back to that in a minute, but here's some extensions of Dennett's work. He does have an interesting materialistic response to some of his prominent counterparts. Jackson's Mary the Neuroscientist. Last week I definitely talked about Mary the Neuroscientist, who Jackson, he comes up with a thought experiment. He says, okay, imagine a neuroscientist who studies, colored vision, right? And she studies it in a textbook, and she knows everything in the research. And in fact, she knows so much about colored vision and processing that she knows more than the current science. She knows everything there is to possibly know of the science of colored vision. However, if she's colorblind, if she grows up in the absence of anything colored red, she will have no idea what the experience of red is. And so Jackson's conclusion is, well, then there's something new to be gained in terms of the subjective information and the objective, right? Mary, the neuroscientist, can study objective information about colored vision, but unless she has the subjective experience of it, she's not going to know anything about what red is. Or at least that's what Jackson and his peers would suggest. But Dennett, he responds by saying, well, no, I think that if Mary studies everything, all of the objective, and for example, what if you raise Mary in a cage without anything of the color red ever, and then you show her one day a banana and you say, this is red. Dennett says, well, maybe she's actually going to look at the banana and not believe them. Maybe she's going to know enough about the objective information and say, well, this is actually a yellow banana and you can't fool me. And Dennett also, another interesting thing, this is a different sort of part of his philosophy, but he believes that there is some degree of free will, right? And so you could call him an emergentist, right? These are people that believe that, I guess I should give a little bit of background here. Dennett, who is a materialist and believes that there's no soul, it's very quick to be like, okay, well, if everything has a physical cause, then there's a long line of physical causes, right? And you can trace back every outcome to an original physical cause, right? So, you think of these, what are these called on the screen? These dominoes, right? The initial domino is going to set off every single other domino, and then everything is predetermined, right? That's what a typical materialist would think. But Dennett does not believe this, or at least he doesn't believe it in the case of a human and their behavior, emotions, and thought, right? So, yes, every single cell, Dennett would say, is kind of like a domino. All of them. They're kind of like dominoes. They don't have any control, whatever. But similarly to the emergence of consciousness, he believes that the emergence of free will is something that happens at a system level. So no, none of the cells are conscious or have free will, but they do, as a system, develop something which is more than what the cells are doing. Personally, I think that's kind of garbage. I just can't get behind it. But it's an interesting way to try to derive free will. And here's an image of emergentism, right? And so this usually applies to, lines of causality and free will. So you have down here basic molecules, right? And then you get higher structured things, maybe like tissues or whatever. And then maybe you get an organism, whatever, right? And as you get into increasing complexity, emergentists would say, well, you start to lose, basic physics and things start to behave at another level. And I know there's chemists who believe that, physics applies at its own special level, but if you study basic physics, this may not predict how particles interact. And then once those, and then someone might say, well, then the rules of chemistry don't fully explain biology. Things start to behave at a system level different than those individual chemicals, right? And then the biology, right? Like you start to consider a cell, you go, okay, well, the biology of cells can't fully explain the psychology of humans and whatever. It becomes more complex than that. And it can't be predicted by simpler principles of, the material world. Okay, Moise, here's my question. So Dennett is essentially proposing that consciousness arises from whatever the dominant information processing currently is. So if you look at this current neural network, right? First of all, I'm going to say, don't imagine that these are individual units of processing or single neurons, Moise. Please instead consider these as perhaps like full networks in their own thing, doing their own processing, right? Let's assume that these are these kinds of like moderators, and they're somehow evaluating, like these are systems of other neural networks evaluating, or consider this one, a system of other neural networks, which just isn't kind of depicted, but just keep it in your mind's eye. And it's moderating the activity of all of these other neural networks, right? And then it's basically processing. So this other system of a bunch of other neural networks is moderating and saying, okay, which of these neural networks is the primary source of information processing? And then somehow it's constructing a computation, which is the consciousness. Is that a viable model? Like, this is my own thought of how could Dennett's and the global workspace theory play out into, what he's suggesting it does.
I'm not sure how you're factoring consciousness into this thing, to be honest, because I've learned all of this from a very strictly mathematical point of view.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure exactly how do you figure consciousness into it.
I guess it's more so like somehow these system of networks over here are seeing whatever of these ones are the most excited. So they're trying to see, which of these networks have the most influence on the other networks around it. And then somehow it determines that these are what are going to be conscious. Or maybe alternatively, it's about a pattern of relationships or something. And this determines consciousness. This is the only way I can think of like Dennett's and the global workspace theory. Like they're suggesting that this is how consciousness becomes a thing. Like at least this is how I take it to mean. So I'm asking you for your thoughts, I guess.
So the thing is, every neuron in that setup that you've talked should have a bias on its own anyways. So
yeah.
If you look at any of the neural network models that like computer science students typically study like in their classes, every neuron has its own bias as well. Like that's the default.
Yeah.
You don't add it.
Your bias.
Sometimes the bias is 0, but
right.
It is always there.
You mean like basically like the weighting relationships between one neuron and other neurons, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And so I'm just saying here like like that's one thing. So I'm just saying with this thing here, like picture it as not just one unit, but just a bunch of units, just not depicted. And then like somehow those all come together. Maybe they're moderated by something else, and that moderates, like that processes all the relationships between all of them. And that's maybe where the consciousness emerges. It's understanding the relationships, how it's almost like a meta relationship. So it's like, this is the basic processing, all unconscious. And then this is the moderator determining like what may be the most important lines of information processing. And then that moderator is moderated by this, which then takes all of these networks and it considers like, okay, with this pattern of relationship, here's the consciousness. I don't know. I'm just saying like, this is the only way I can think that what he's suggesting would be possible.
Yeah, I do understand like what you're getting at. Yeah, but like honestly, I don't have any thoughts on this one because, like I said, I'm coming from a very mathematical background, and
one
of
my issues, even with this model, is like again the evolutionary reason. Why would your brain be set up in this way? This is like incredibly complicated, right? Because you would need something to moderate a bunch of processes in the brain, or at least I guess you could moderate only the higher level processes. But you would ask why? Like, why would evolution ever do this? And again, like once you get up to here, so the thing that's moderating the moderator, you're still ultimately asked like what reinforced that network to determine that that's the appropriate consciousness. You know what I mean? Like in terms of computation, like what reinforced that and said, oh, moderator, you're appropriately moderating